Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Well, as I mentioned, it is the most read story today on the Bloomberg terminal. It's about a place in Santa Clara, California, where Porsches, Corvettes, and Lamborghinis take up the parking spaces. It's the parking lot of a company whose stock is up more than 3,700% since the beginning of 2019. The company has piled on market cap faster than any other in history, so it's made a lot of people who work there pretty wealthy. We're talking vacation homes, the Super Bowl, those vehicles, NBA Finals. They also work a lot. If you haven't guessed it already, we're talking about Nvidia. It's a place where people work hard. In fact, the hours are grueling and high stress, current and former employees say, leaving little time for the jet-setting, home buying, and leisure many can now afford. A culture problem is brewing, said the people who asked not to be identified for fear of retribution. Ellen Huet is Bloomberg News tech features writer, and she contributed to this story, which I mentioned is the most read on the Bloomberg terminal. Ellen joins us from San Francisco. So Ellen, what is it like to work at Nvidia?
Well, I think it's been quite a ride for Nvidia employees, especially those who have been there for more than just a few years. Keep in mind, this company is decades old. It's been around for a really long time. And it's one of those companies that, unless you were really enmeshed in Silicon Valley, you might not know it, or you might even mispronounce its name, obviously, until the last couple of years when, the stock price and sort of the AI boom has made Nvidia a household name. And so if you are an employee who only started working there recently, maybe your life is about normal. But if you've been there maybe 5, 10 years and you are still there, chances are you are extremely wealthy if you have held onto your stock. Obviously, there are different decisions that employees have made about how to manage this, but it's just been kind of an unexpected boom for a lot of people who have worked there at a company that for a long time was not like the flashiest one in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and of course, definitely flashy now. I definitely recommend going to the article. Looks like a photo that was taken in an Nvidia parking garage of one of those lime green luxury cars. And it was a really interesting read, a peek into the culture at Nvidia and sort of the way that Jensen Huang approaches managing a company. He doesn't like firing employees, for example. He prefers to torture them into greatness. What does that mean, Ellen?
Well, first, I just want to mention about the car. Something special about it is that that's not like a car color that you can get, at a dealership. I don't know where you buy luxury cars, but basically, apparently, that car has been custom wrapped in that color. That's the color. It's this sort of lime green. That's Nvidia's color logo. So again, something that a lot of people might not recognize because, if you ask them, well, what does the Nvidia logo look like? They might not know.
Is it Nvidia green or is it brat green? I feel like that summer.
It's pretty close, yeah.
It's up for
a hot
nowadays.
Nvidia summer, yeah. But to go back to your question about company culture, you're totally right. Jensen Huang is a really interesting, kind of idiosyncratic CEO, someone who has spoken really openly about, not firing employees, not laying them off during the big layoffs in the tech sector, a couple years ago. He made a big show of saying, we're not going to be cutting jobs. But that does not mean that it is easy to work at Nvidia. Apparently, according to people who have worked there for a long time, and people who are currently working there, it's a really demanding work environment, and maybe more so even than some of its competitors. Jensen has gone on and talked a lot about, torturing his employees into greatness. He went on 60 Minutes recently and was talking about how he envisions working at Nvidia being the way in which a lot of employees can do their life's work. And his take is that shouldn't be easy. It should, if you're going to do extraordinary things, that shouldn't be, that should be effortful. That's something I think he stands by as a stance. And employees feel that every day at work, long hours, many meetings. And in particular, that shows up because the way that Nvidia is organized is a pretty flat organizational structure. There are many, many people who report directly to the CEO, and to each of those people, there are dozens, 40 plus people might be reporting to the same person. That creates the idea is it's sort of everyone's responsible for themselves, but it can create a lot of organizational chaos that former employees were telling, our reporting team that contributes to stress working every day at Nvidia.
Ellen, I have a couple questions here. One, they do really like these employees, at least according to ratings featured in the story from Glassdoor. They do really like Johnsson and working for him, more so than at peer companies. I'm wondering, you're out there in Silicon Valley, you speak to a lot of folks who work at these big companies that have been high-flying for years, Meta Platforms, Apple, Amazon, and the like, part of the Mag 7. Is what happens at Nvidia culture-wise a lot different, and how hard these employees work? Is it a lot different than what happens at these other tech companies?
I think it's different maybe to a degree, but in the sense that it's pretty common for these companies to demand a lot of work from them. But I do think something changes in a company's culture when you have this type of peak that Nvidia is at, where all of a sudden employees are really rich. I think we saw a decade ago kind of the rise of Google millionaires, Facebook millionaires, and now we might be seeing this sort of Nvidia millionaires coming out. And I think having that kind of wealth, and especially wealth disparity within the company, like again, if you joined more recently, you're not banking the kind of money that someone who joined 10 years ago is. And this sort of conflict came up even within NVIDIA at an internal meeting last year, where employees asked, what do we do about some of our coworkers who feel like they're just coasting because they've made so much money, like they don't need to work anymore, but they don't want to quit because the paycheck is too good. And so I think part of what this story is getting at is this brewing tension that might be coming up at the company or inside the company related to the fact that they've done so well. It's this after effect of just making a lot of people wealthy, but not everyone.
I believe, Katie, in the Silicon Valley show on HBO, they referred to that as resting investing.
Yeah, so I haven't watched the show, but I appreciate that you spelled out the reference for me. Otherwise, I would have just gone along with it. So there are, even at NVIDIA, of course, there's people who are resting investing, it seems like. I do appreciate that this is a Bloomberg News story, so we do have some data here to sort of back up how Wang is perceived as a leader. If you take a look at Glassdoor, his approval rating is 97%. That's higher than his peers over at Alphabet, Apple, Meta, and Amazon. But talk to us a little bit about the reporting that went into this piece of talking to some of those former employees. I believe in at least two of these anecdotes, there was a lot of shouting that was mentioned when it came to the many, many meetings that it sounds like these employees have to sit through every day.
Yeah, that was a bit of a motif, I think, sort of hot tempers, sort of like aggressive directness coming up in these meetings. Johnsson also has this famous policy within NVIDIA in which people are asked to email to the central email 5 things. It's like 5 things, every couple weeks that are the most important things they're working on. And you never know if you might just get an email directly from him asking you something about what you're working on. So there is this sort of like, no gatekeepers, this directness. We have no time to be like nice and soft with each other. We're going to be focused on, running the company as aggressively as possible. So I think that's part of the culture. Another interesting data point has to do with turnover at the company. According to the company's own numbers, their annual turnover in 2023 was somewhere around 5%. And maybe that was 2022, but basically this most recent number, it dropped by half, so it's about 2.5%. And I think you can look at those numbers, and of course they don't say why people are sticking around, but look, if all of a sudden your pay package, because of its stock compensation, is worth 20 times more than you thought it was going to be, that might be a good reason to stick around as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue that they would stick around with a pay package such as that and the promise of more equity or shares vesting. Ellen, we should note that NVIDIA did decline to comment for this story. Before we let you go, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a story that you published late last week about the Find My Friends feature on iPhones. Increasingly becoming popular, at least with my group of friends, especially with my family. Talk a little bit about your experience using this service that I think a few years ago many people would find kind of invasive.
Yeah, I mean, I am a big evangelist of Find My Friends. I think it's not only is it convenient, it's just really fun. Like, I probably have about 20 people, close friends of mine, my siblings, who share their locations with me 24/7, and I do the same back to them. A lot of us use Apple's Find My app, but I also have a few people who are Android users where I track them on Google Maps, which is also pretty fun. And obviously, there are considerations that you should take into account before you share your location with someone. And I think, as I say in the piece, it's a good additive to a high trust relationship, but it could create awkwardness or even danger, if you share it with someone where that's not a good relationship. But in general, I think what I find interesting about it is just this evolution of our tech habits and then the evolution of our expectations that come with it. So all of a sudden, this thing that a few years ago might have been like weird or invasive, I'm just consistently hearing more people talk about how fun it is, how nice it is to just, sometimes I just look at my phone and see, oh, my friends are like at work, or like one of them's traveling, or I just get to like peek in and see where they are, and I think that's really sweet.
So I have two comments on this. Both are about my parents. One, my dad is reading 1984 right now, and he keeps making the joke that we don't have to worry about Big Brother watching us. We've actually invited them into our homes, and we put it on our body. But the other point that I have to make is about my mom. Actually, in the last year, she texted our family group chat and said, do you guys want to do Find My Friends? And my response was, I'm 31. Maybe when I was 15, this would have made sense. So I kind of want to.
So the answer was no to your mom. You don't share your location with your mom?
No.
Oh, I share mine with my mom.
Well, what is the appeal of that? And maybe Ellen, I'll ask you. I mean, why do you need to track your parents? Why do you need to track your friends, for example, who I assume are also adults?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, as with many tech habits, like having the internet on your phone, the first pitch is convenience, right? This is how they often start. It's like, oh, how convenient is it for me to have my best friend's location? That means when she's coming by to pick me up and we're going to go out to dinner, she doesn't need to dangerously pull out her phone while driving and text me I'm a couple minutes away. I can just watch her dot. And when she gets close, I'll step out and I can meet her. And I think it starts out convenient, and then it becomes kind of I think if a lot of stories have been written about how Gen Z has embraced location sharing, and I think for them, they see it, and I feel the same way, as almost a token of intimacy or connection in a friendship, and this sense of oh, I trust you to, handle this, this sensitive information with care.
Yeah, there's a serious level of trust. I have some friends who a few years ago, 8 years ago, shared their location with me for a wedding and forgot. Now I know where they are at all
I don't even
times.
text my friends back.
A big thank you to Ellen Huet out there in San Francisco.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Boeing's newly installed CEO, Kelly Ortberg, faces a dilemma that pits its national duty against strained cash reserves. This after a humiliating setback over the weekend. This was when NASA announced that they would not be sending astronauts home from the space station on the faulty spacecraft. Here's NASA Administrator Bill Nelson on Saturday.
Space flight is risky, even at its safest, and even at its most routine. And a test flight by nature is neither safe nor routine. And so the decision to keep Butch and Sonny aboard the International Space Station and bring the Boeing Starliner home uncrewed is a result of a commitment to safety.
That was NASA Administrator Bill Nelson on Saturday, talking about the Starliner returning empty without those astronauts who are aboard the International Space Station. This is just one embarrassing moment of many for Boeing. During an epically bad year, it's included that near catastrophic blowout of an airborne 737 MAX jetliner. That was in January, federal investigations, and the executive suite shakeup. Boeing's execs now must face thorny questions about the company's commitment to human spaceflight and to Starliner. We've got with us Julie Johnsson, Bloomberg News senior aerospace reporter. She joins us from Chicago. Julie, I just want to start to bring everyone up to speed with what happened to Starliner, why those astronauts found themselves stuck aboard the International Space Station, and then we'll get to where Boeing goes from here.
Okay, fair enough. Though, honestly, we should have Lauren Grush on this call for a really informed discussion.
I think she's getting ready for tomorrow's launch.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you a semi-informed discussion. So this all gets back to what are known as reaction control system thrusters. And they're little motors or engines that help position the spacecraft, Starliner, in orbit. And there have been now on 2 consecutive missions, there have been glitchy problems with these thrusters on what's known as the service module. This is the part of the vehicle that will burn up in space. This is not the capsule itself, but it's all part of the propulsion system. So anyway, as you know, back in June, as Starliner was coming in to dock with the ISS, 5 of these thrusters failed. And NASA and Boeing eventually were able to get 4 of them back unstuck and working together again. And the docking went ahead and the astronauts went on board. That launched some furious studying at NASA and Boeing into what was going on. And I think Boeing feels confident that they've isolated the problem. NASA was not as confident. And by the way, you know, post Challenger, post Columbia, NASA's really emphasizing safety. And I think you know, they don't want to take any unnecessary risks, especially when there are humans involved. So even though 27 out of the 28 thrusters on the service module eventually were working, I think NASA just didn't feel comfortable, you know, that one of them wouldn't fail again, and made this really difficult decision.
Julie, now to the future of the space program at Boeing, the Starliner that you speak of, many, many years delayed, many dollars in cost overruns. If we look at where Boeing gets its revenue, about 32% of its revenue in 2023 comes from defense, space, and security. How important is space to Boeing's future under Kelly Ortberg moving forward?
Oh man, that's the big question. And we just don't know right now what his thinking is. It's early days, and he's going to take some months now to evaluate everything. But I mean, Boeing is such a proud space company, space pioneer. You know, they were instrumental. Tim, I know you're an av geek,
Yep.
and an aerospace nut, as am I. But you know, it rescued the Saturn rocket program back in the 60s. It almost bankrupted the company. They were a key player with the space shuttle program. You know, they're the primary contractor on the International Space Station. So they've got this really proud legacy. But then, you know, SpaceX has come in and just totally revolutionized the business. And for whatever complex reasons, you know, Boeing's not been able to keep pace or to meet the obligations that it has right now with Starliner. So you've got a new guy coming in. He's got a mandate to look at everything, and it's not a given that you know that the company would continue with Starliner, according to the analysts that I've talked to. And what was interesting to me, Bill Nelson on Saturday said, "Hey, Ortberg assured me that, you know, Boeing's in, basically, but we didn't see a strong, you know, matching statement from Boeing." And again, I just think you know, part of it is they don't know the next steps beyond Starliner coming to Earth in September.
Well, Julie, to that point, I mean, this question has been asked for a while now, and it predates, of course, Kelly Ortberg. You have in your story that late last year, Chief Financial Officer Brian West told a small gathering of investors that the company had a decision to make about future investment in the program. So I guess the question I have for you is, what kind of timeline do they have to make that decision? Because I have to imagine this is a very expensive waiting period.
Yeah, it is. It is. But I really think, I mean, there's so many unknowns right now. If Starliner performs flawlessly when it flies back without humans in September, then this becomes really, you know, complicated for Boeing and for NASA. I mean, it feels like the thruster issue needs to be resolved, and with no, you know, maybe it needs to be redesigned, but I don't, you know, can NASA certify this vehicle without another test flight, which, by the way, that's another $500 million out, you know, out of Boeing's pocket for a test flight. So the decisions are going to stack up, but I don't think anything will be made imminently. And the other thing is that if Boeing's able to get its commercial factories going, airplanes rolling out the door, then its finances get better and it's got more cushion, you know, to to make these thorny decisions around, national interest and duty and honor.
Well, Julie, we only have like 10 seconds left, but if you were to rank Kelly Ortberg's biggest five priorities, would figuring out the future of space at Boeing even be in the top 5?
No.
Yeah, so that's some incredible context there. Julie Johnsson, hey, we always love it when you join us. Everybody check out Julie's story on the Bloomberg terminal. Julie's Bloomberg News senior aerospace reporter joining us from Chicago.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Construction is underway in Wyoming for a new nuclear power plant that Bill Gates hopes will revolutionize how power is generated. It's going to use sodium instead of water for cooling in the plant. The plant, though, is expected to cost up to $4 billion. It comes after Georgia just built 2 new nuclear reactors as the country, that's us, U.S., reconsiders nuclear power as a way to create green energy. We've got back with us Maria Korsnick, president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Maria, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Happy to be back.
Well, it's good to have you back with us. I'm wondering how you're looking at the landscape right now. We do have the pleasure of checking with you every few months and getting an understanding of how you're viewing the landscape as sort of on the side that represents the nuclear power industry. Do you think that the appetite just in the last few months has increased for nuclear power?
I do. I mean, demand, right? Look at all those different forecasts that have come out between AI and machine learning, as well as the electricity that's just needed to transition manufacturing and onshore that. So a lot of new players sitting at the table with us, a lot of those tech companies, a lot of those chemical companies. It's a very exciting time in nuclear.
And it's interesting to think about sort of the demographical, I hope that's a word, perspectives of nuclear, because nuclear for a lot of people is an off-putting word. But you highlighted some recent reporting from our colleagues over at the Wall Street Journal that when it comes to Gen Z voters, perhaps there's a bit more of an embrace of nuclear there than compared to, say, some of the older demographics.
Absolutely. I think the survey that you're referring to said 4 out of 5 of the Gen Zers support more nuclear power. And, like nuclear is cool again, right? To some of these voters. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really rebrand nuclear in terms of what does it bring? It brings that round the clock, very clean, highly reliable energy. And it's at a time when people are really focused on climate and they're focused on energy security, and nuclear brings both.
Well, I'm going to go where we always go with you, which is where the mistakes were made over the last 30 or 40 years when it comes to the U.S. nuclear industry. I know this isn't about looking backward, but we find ourselves in a place where we have closed many nuclear power plants in the U.S. You see in Europe, too, a movement away in some countries that I think some countries, it's fair to say, regret when it comes to nuclear energy. How did we get to where we are? And do we ever get back to a place where we have the appetite for the actual amount of money that needs to be invested to build these things?
Yeah, absolutely think we do. When you say, how did we get where we are? I can speak into the United States. Think back 10, 15 years, and, we had really low prices of natural gas. You had high incentives on wind and solar. And, we were really pushing nuclear out of the marketplace. And I think what you look at today is really strong demand, high attention on carbon-free, and the need for energy security. And it's not just happening here in the United States. I've traveled around the world where they've shut them down. They're talking about, wait a minute, was that a good decision? Where they haven't shut them down, but they thought about shutting them down. They've changed their mind. France is a great example. Made a U-turn, said, no, we're not shutting them down. In fact, we're going to build more. And I was just in Finland and Sweden, and they're talking about the same thing. Let's have more nuclear.
Do you think it was a reaction to Three Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, as to why a lot of the world decided to move away from nuclear?
Not so much in the United States, I'll be honest, but elsewhere in the world, I do think that Fukushima had an impact and had an effect. In fact, let's just talk about that for a minute. Japan's talking about restarting plants, in fact, has restarted plants, and they're talking about building more. So, if the country that had the challenge is also talking about moving forward, that should really mean something to us. That means that on balance, really looking at this, understanding what's being brought to the marketplace and to the people, that clean energy, highly reliable, it really matters. And that's where nuclear is.
Well, looking forward, Maria, let's assume that survey that we were talking about, the fact that the majority of Gen Z voters really does support nuclear. How long of a timeline are we talking about? Those shutdown plants that Tim and you were referencing, is it as easy as flipping a switch? What does it actually look like to start to rely on nuclear again?
So let's talk about the nuclear we have today, right? We have 94 beautiful plants operating today, producing almost 20% of the energy here in the United States. And as we go forward, there's some things that are very close to coming on. Those are micro reactors, and you're going to be hearing about them in the next few years. And then after that, the small modular reactors as well. So think about that in the end of the 20s into the early 2030s. So very close. Sometimes people think new nuclear is really far away. It's not. Those first of a kinds are going to come over here in the next, 5 to 7 years. And think about those two plants that were just built in Georgia, the AP1000s. Well, we built two and we're ready to build more. And so that technology is already ready to get going.
We built those, but those were years behind schedule and many, many dollars over budget, we should note, Maria. When it comes to the next gen nuclear reactors, I'm curious if any of the technology thus far, when it comes to small modular reactors, for example, has that been proven to work yet anywhere?
So the technology, the thing that makes it work, there's really not a lot of new there. In other words, some of these things, in fact, we built back in the 1960s. What we're doing now is we're taking that technology and we're applying it and bringing new things to the marketplace. And so I think the real guess isn't, is it going to work or not? It's, oh yeah, it's going to work. And now what can we learn about how efficiently can we build it? How, each technology is going to have, a little bit of a learning curve to sort of better understand it. But these are wonderful opportunities to be brought to the marketplace.
Well, it feels like energy needs have once again entered into broader conversation because we talk about energy demand in the context of AI all the time now. I mean, you think about how much just energy AI needs, especially some of these data centers. I mean, do you see an opportunity for the nuclear industry to seize on this moment?
Absolutely. In fact, we're having those conversations now. We're having conversations with the data centers, right? We're having conversations with large chemical companies. We're having conversations with folks that we're saying, how are we going to get that clean energy of the future? Because, those companies, they want to brag about the fact that their product was made clean, right? Well, you need clean energy in order to have those bragging rights. So it's important to them. They want to position themselves for the future. But they want it they want it all the time, highly reliable, 724. And so, there's other technologies, but they need to be paired with that backbone of highly reliable carbon-free energy. And that's what nuclear brings to the conversation.
All right, what about when it comes...
It's a great opportunity.
Maria, what about when it comes to waste? What is the solution for nuclear waste? It seems like nobody wants it.
I'm going to tell you, and I hope you're going to bring me on at some point in the future and we'll say, I told you that nuclear waste was going to be a good thing. The nuclear waste that we have today, in the future, I think it has opportunities to be used. In the meantime, let's store it really safe. We do that. I just came back from Finland a couple of weeks ago. They just put into commission their deep geologic repository. There's nothing magic about that. There's no reason that the United States can't do the same thing, and I'm sure we will.
Okay, where should we do it in the U.S.?
Well, we're going to use a consent process. So we'll be asking different folks, in fact, who wants it. And so how about this? It would be nice to be fought over, wouldn't it? Who wants to have the nuclear waste? Who wants to have that as part of their business function? Let's get there.
Well, Tim, you have a backyard, don't you?
Yeah.
You could put it in there.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Katie. That's a great idea.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe we could keep it out at the barn where your horse is.
That's true. Another good suggestion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll noodle on it, but definitely have to have Maria on for that I told you so moment.
Yeah, Maria, looking forward to that. We ask you the question every time about nuclear waste, and I do. I think it's fair to say, hope we all get to a point where we can figure out the right thing to do with nuclear waste, and maybe get to a point where, like you say, businesses are fighting over it. That's Maria Korsnick, President and CEO at the Nuclear Energy Institute, joining us from Washington, D.C.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week, live in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Tick-tock, less than 20 minutes to go to the close of trading on this sleepy Monday.
I don't know. You take a look at markets. Volumes are down, but there's definitely a lot of movement there to the downside. Definitely not the happy story we were telling on Friday.
Yeah, but it's mega caps that are moving lower because you got 275 stocks in the S&P 500
but doesn't
moving
that
higher.
feel important if the stock market's biggest companies are moving to the downside?
Oh, it does. It does feel important. Let's see what Dave Harden has to say about all this. He's founder and chief investment officer over at Summit Global Investments. He's one of the few people who's not on vacation, although maybe you are on vacation. You're visiting us from Utah.
Well, it's not always a vacation in New York, but let's face it, today's weather's pretty good. So
I don't know. They don't allow us outside. Is it nice?
Boy,
You went
does
outside
it look
for lunch,
nice.
did you?
I did, and then I felt the mothership calling me back.
I'm just kidding. They do let us outside.
Sometimes
they do.
The food inside is nice too.
The food inside is good here. We don't have to go outside. How does market post Jackson Hole? How does the macro environment feel to you?
Well, let's clearly say there was a couple comments there in Jackson Hole that were important.
Okay.
Right? And they were important because it said that they are going to change policy. And now 25 points is a foregone conclusion. Like, that's going to happen, right? I think the markets have baked that in by now. So now it's, what do they do next? Are they going to do 3? Is one of them going to be a 50 basis points? So I think the markets are in a wait and see. And the thing that's interesting is September labor market numbers. Every year, especially around elections, for whatever reason, October has the highest revisions. So I don't really put a lot of faith on the numbers because they're going to get revised, deeply revised, more than anything else throughout the year.
Yeah, it feels like quality of the data has come into question, especially when it comes to the BLS. A lot of snafus there. And then that revision last week, I mean, I'm really curious to hear how you're factoring that in.
Well, I think, like most people, the reality is that the data, bad news means that cuts are coming, right? And good news is, well, good. Mm-hmm. So right now we're kind of in a bad news is good because that means the Fed's puts on the line and it's going to happen. And good news is good. So even though we're down today, which is not always easy, I think the markets crawl higher for the next couple months just in choppy trading.
There was a bad news is bad just a few weeks ago when we got those July jobs numbers.
Yeah, for sure.
Was that a one-off?
Well, I think
in terms of labor market weakness?
I think in the sense that the Fed hadn't come out and said what they said. So post Jackson Hole, now bad news is, okay, yeah, the Fed's puts there. So I think before that, it was bad. We didn't know what they were going to do. In fact, can you remember back 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was on there with you that it was, we got to have an emergency rate cut. And now we've been to, well, we're going to have a rate cut.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't that crazy?
It was.
A few weeks ago?
Yeah. And there's still a lot of crazy talk going around. I think it was Kelly Lyons who was telling us that Elizabeth Warren was saying that the Fed should cut by 75 basis points.
But she's been saying the Fed needs to cut rates for 2 years at this point.
I know.
Or more.
Talk about.
And her whole thing is because of housing and
right.
Mortgage rates.
Well, for sure. But if you cut rates, then you have a lot of pent up demand on the other side when it comes to the housing market. But even still, I'm curious to hear your view because Elizabeth Warren aside, Kathy Jones, for example, from Charles Schwab has made the case that the Fed should go 50 in September. That you think about where rates are right now, north of 5%, that's way too restrictive relative to the economic reality. I'm curious your view on what the Fed should do in September, 25 or 50, and what you think they actually will deliver.
It's a great question. Okay, I think should do is real. Here's the key. We've had numbers like unemployment and like the inverted yield curve point towards recession for 30 straight years. And each time this has happened, the Fed had an opportunity to act and wasn't able to prevent a recession. So what is this Fed going to do differently than the past 30 to 45 years? Very smart people were there, and yet they weren't able to stop it. So the data says, hey, there's a recession on the line. What are they going to do? I think they should cut 50, but the reality is I don't think this Fed is aggressive. And so they've always been patient. They've always been a little bit behind the curve. And so I think they're going to be patient.
When do we get to a point where we don't have to ask you or market observers whether or not we're in a recession? The data becomes so clear that we are in a recession.
Well, I'm hoping against history here, but the reality is that I hope that there's not one. I don't feel like we're in one right now. And so it would have to be, you would see the labor numbers continue to, spiral down. You'd have to see, I think, other numbers come out.
Like a jobs report that shows instead of additions.
Yeah, and I think you're going to have to see more layoffs in the market. Really companies signaling there's problems. And right now, earnings and guidances are all fairly good.
Yeah. I will say I find the idea of a rolling recession pretty compelling because overall it seems like on broad metrics the economy has held up. But then, I talked to some of my friends who were working in startups last summer. That space definitely seemed like it was in a bit of a recession. But I guess I'm wondering how you structure a portfolio around that because you mentioned that bad news is good news and good news is kind of good news. I mean, is that a green light for risk assets?
Not really. I think you have to be picky. To have a recession-proof portfolio, you need to manage your risk. So think, for example, what does well in both environments if we have a recession and even coming out of a recession. So for me today, for example, I'll look at healthcare. Healthcare to me is the new utility, right? You take a look at somebody that's taking some drugs, they've lost 20, 30 pounds, or they've maybe reduced their diabetes medication. Are they coming off those drugs? The answer is not on your life, right? If the power goes out, you're going to learn to deal with it. But if you drop your phone, if you can't take that drug, you're going to go get a new phone today. You're going to go see a different doctor today. So to me, healthcare has done very, very well. It's up over 18%, month to date. But if you look at, does it still have legs to run? Absolutely. Eli Lilly just raised their guidance. They have fantastic earnings. So to me, I think you have to manage risk with individual holdings. You have to stay diversified and look for those companies that are going to survive regardless what the Fed does.
Dave, where do you not want to be right now?
I think you got to be careful with some of the AI names. Now, we know Nvidia.
Like Nvidia?
Well, we know they're going to come out, and I think they're going to do great. Can they do good enough? I mean, everybody wants them to blow it out of the water so that this market can just, hang their hat on that and continue. But the reality is they got some issues they have to solve across the whole spectrum. So I'd be really cautious if you're going to invest in tech. Look for high free cash flow. Look for still high quality earnings. Look for something that if AI doesn't pan out, you still have a real big, large, great company working for you, right? So for like Microsoft is a great example.
That's really interesting. And I actually want to go back to your point on healthcare and having to be picky there because I was actually looking at shares of United Health for whatever reason earlier today, and they're close to an all-time high. But then you take a look at, some of the worst performers on the S&P 500. You have Dexcom in there, for example, sort of one of the flip side of the GLP-1 trade. I mean, just 30 seconds, that due diligence, it sounds like you're doing that on a company by company level when you're taking a look at that sector.
You have to, but your due diligence has to be kind of on its head. Don't look for companies that are just going to go crazy to the upside, right? Because that's not the market we're in. We're not at the throw the dart market. We're at the market where you have to look at the downside. So look at the risk. Turn over more rocks. If you're going to expect the boats, yes, the tide will raise them all. Look for the holes in the boats. Don't use those ones.
Dave, appreciate you joining us. Dave Harden, founder and CIO over at Summit Global Investments, joining us here.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.